Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Document and Eyewitness is an intimate history of rough trade. It's practically a byword for the history of independent music over the past 50 years. And it's telling the story from the inside of basically a legendary label, shop, you name it, you got it. It is a new book updated by Neil Taylor. Delighted to say that Neil joins me probably somewhere in the back of a vinyl vault, thumbing through obscure B-sides. Neil, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Giles.
Where do we find you this morning? Are you at the back of one of the stores or something? Whereabouts are you today?
No, today I'm in my front room, which is actually full of books and not full of records.
So for those who don't know, explain a little bit about your relationship with rough trade and how you're eminently qualified to write Document and Eyewitness.
Well, I don't think I am eminently qualified, but I was an NME journalist in the 1980s, and I compiled C86, so I'd always had an involvement with independent music. Obviously, I'd known Jeff at the time. He was dealing with a band that I was very involved with, which is the Jesus and Mary chain. And so... it was a long time ago, but, eventually a plan was hatched to write the history of rough trade. But I wanted it to be a people history as much as a music history.
Yeah, because you could go through the whole sort of, if you like, the discography, on this date that this was released and it got to this in the charts, or they went on this tour and the whole thing. But rough trade is sort of shorthand, isn't it? Could we say it's shorthand for people who love music getting into the business, not for the business of music, but for the love of music, if that makes any sense at all, Neil?
It does make sense. In fact, I think right at the very start in 1976, this was pre-Margaret Thatcher. This was the year of the sort of bin strikes in London. The whole place was like a sort of... still had a post-World War II hangover. And what rough trade did was came along and effectively revolutionised the music business, both in terms of the way it treated its artists and in the radical new way in which it started to sell records. And along the way, it helped create post-punk with those wonderful bands, The Fall, Cabaret Voltaire, The Raincoats, Swell Maps. You carry on, Scritti Politti. It was wonderful.
It's interesting you say that because the revolutionised the way, because by we got to sort of 74, 75, we've kind of got into, I don't know, Rod Stewart, Atlantic Crossing, it's become a business. Pink Floyd famously wrote, by the way, which one is Pink? And it has become as boring and corporate, the major record labels, as selling photocopiers.
Well, Robert Wire, a rough trade artist, flippantly said that, after a period of long hair and long guitar solos, it was inevitable that we'd have short hair and short guitar solos. But, punk rattled the cage of the established music business, and rough trade really set out to enable it. You had bands like the Desperate Bicycles and Scritti Politti demystifying the process of making a record. They would print on the cover of their records how much they cost, where they got it printed, where they got it pressed. And so many bands came along and were then able, on the back of punk, to make their own records, and rough trade was inevitably where they went to try to sell them. And rough trade would take 10 copies, 20 copies, then shops would phone up rough trade and say, we can't get the records, can you get them? So rough trade would take 100 copies, then an artist would come in like Daniel Miller of Mute, The Normal, and rough trade would say, print up 2,000 and we'll press the lot for you. And that's how it became a record label. And of course,
we had that reaction to sort of the 8-year-long guitar solos and the 37,000 track overlays, because you've got what's called pub rock, and that might sound a bit sort of really, but in like 74, 75, it's a reaction, and that gives birth in a kind of way to punk, because you've got Kilburn, you've got Kilburn and the Hot Rod, you've got Feel Good, of course, and it is getting back to those basics and cutting a record as sort of they did in the 50s, walking into a booth, putting, a couple of nickels in it and pressing your own record.
Well, I think you're right. There were there were sort of supersized boozers like the Hope and Anchor, which put on bands, and you had these, Ducks Deluxe, the bands you've mentioned coming along and playing. The whole stiff records scene came out of that. And Jeff Travis, who started Rough Trade prior to opening the shop, those were the kind of bands he was going to see. You know, he loved Nick Lowe, he loved, Ducks Deluxe, he liked a lot of those bands. So you're right, that really led into that whole punk scene. But as I say, I mean, I think by demystifying it and by enabling it, that was how Rough Trade really made its contribution. I mean, there's a great John Peel quote, I think you might have read it, where he says, look, if they robbed a few phone boxes and the bass player sold his motorbike, then they can make a record. And it was easy, it was cheap, go and do it.
So is it the record shop first and the record label, or is it the other way around?
No, the record shop opens in 1976. Then they're doing a sort of primitive form of distribution, all these records coming in. Then in 1978, they start the label with Stiff Little Fingers. The first Stiff Little Fingers album, which was the first album on the label, sold 100,000 copies. Now, you're talking about a record that was essentially pressed up and distributed and made from a tiny shop in Kensington Park Road.
And not only that, there is no internet, there is no mail. There's mail order, but a lot of it's going to have to actually be people walking in and buying the bleeding record, in its physical form.
Yeah, well, I mean, just jumping forward a short time, if you take Joy Division, the first pressing of Unknown Pleasures were delivered to the Rough Trade shop, and there wasn't room to store them, so they were left on the pavement outside.
No.
5,000 copies of this record. Had it rained, the whole course of sort of post-punk would be different. So it was very much Heath Robinson.
So what sort of marks them out? Because there are lots of sort of independent record labels that rise and fall as punk sort of, burns so very, very brightly and then burns out. I mean, is there a business sense in there, as well as being in love with music and wanting to put that music to the forefront in a way that, as you mentioned, perhaps only the mighty John Peel is doing in the sort of disco infused mid to late 70s. I mean, what marks out Rough Trade's sort of rise, as it were?
Well, I think what marks it out, what I should say, and of course, which I haven't mentioned so far, is the what a fabulous curator Jeff Travis was in picking out these bands and finding these records to release. One thinks only of, for instance, the Smiths in 1983, when the band comes down from Manchester and playing Hand in Glove. And, immediately he senses this is something important. So I think very few A&R people had that kind of ability. But perhaps principally, Rough Trade had come in and had helped set up the distribution network. So a lot of these other labels, like Mute and Beggar's Banquet, who were selling large quantities of records, were selling them through Rough Trade.
Right.
So it became more important, really.
When did they move? Did they move to the Portobello Road? Because the shop's still there.
They started. The shop opened in Kensington Park Road. Then it moved to Blenheim Crescent when it became impossible to expand the shop anymore. And then they moved from Blenheim Crescent during the era of the Smiths. I think, but I could have got this wrong, just before The Queen is Dead, or possibly even the first album, they moved to King's Cross, and that's when their problems really started. And, they had grown too big and really just hadn't got the experience to deal with it.
So this book is written. As I said before, it's not a then they did this and then they did that. It's very much sort of a personal, if you like, look at rough trade. So who do you kind of speak to? I mean, where do you start? I mean, I know you're at the Enemy, and kids, trust me, back in the 70s and the 80s, Enemy was the Bible. If you wanted to find out what was going on, you just got NME. So how, presumably you had the contacts and some sort of blurred memory notes taken at the time?
Well, I think it was just important to try to track down as many people as possible that were involved in the operation. I mean, the late Richard Scott is an important figure that very few people, are aware of outside the industry. But he, along with Jeff, helped set up the cartel. He decided one day that, instead of sending these records out to Norwich, to Liverpool, to Edinburgh, to Bristol, why don't we set up hubs in those areas so that people in those areas can become part of the music business without having to move to London? Because the music business, of course, has been so London-centric. So I contacted these people, and I'm glad I did, because sadly, of course, many of them are no longer with us now. I mean, it is 50 years old. And, so many people don't last forever.
Yeah, and some of the lifestyle options perhaps weren't going to add to the longevity. But if you think about it, I mean, media now, it's all about going to, BBC going to Manchester, so-and-so going to Liverpool. So this idea of hubs, because it was always the thing, Irish bands had to come to London. So it is really ahead of its time by saying we're going to have these sort of spheres of influence, as it were.
I think so. I mean, one of the problems I felt was that, in creating these hubs, they were taking on great responsibility in terms of the cost. And I think that ultimately did fool them. The old joke was that it was the Royal Mail that made the most out of rough trade because it was so difficult. These days, of course, with downloads, with digital culture, that simply wouldn't happen. In the same way that these days, you don't need a band, you need one man and a computer, and you can make the same sort of noise that an orchestra can make. It was inevitably it reached a point where the thing sort of got too big to handle. And then in 1991, it all came tumbling down. The receivers were brought in and lawsuits flying around. And, at the time, the Smiths were a huge band, and they were caught in the maelstrom of this. They had to figure out a way of buying themselves out or selling, the crown jewels. So then Rough Trade went dormant, but of course it has come back spectacularly in the 2000s with, they began putting records out by the Strokes, by the Libertines, Jeanette Lee, a hugely formidable partner of Jeff Travis's, joined. Previously, she'd been in Public Image Limited. She'd run Acme Attractions, which was a rival to Malcolm McLaren's Sex boutique. And together they began building up, this new roster of artists. And in fact, there's been more contemporary rough trade than historical rough trade, although at the 50th anniversary, one always was a temptation, of course, always to look back. And if you bring it up to date, the artists they have now, Amon and the Sniffers, Geordie Greep, Caroline, Lankham, Lisa O'Neill, it is a truly formidable contemporary label.
Because the thing is, everything comes through. Everything comes sort of, full circle. But people, the public might think, oh well, it's just kids doing endless rap for Spotify, and there's no mid lates anymore, the whole thing. But there is a thriving, as it was in 75, 76, there is a thriving live scene who are playing small pubs, small clubs, real, quote unquote, real music. And it's not about the marketing and how many hits you get on your Instagram, but it's actually about being sweaty and enduring the transformative sort of live music experience.
I think so. I mean, a band like Amon and the Sniffers are fantastic live. And they have the same kind of, you get the same kind of feeling there as you might have got if you'd gone to see the Slits in 1977. It's the scene is every bit as vibrant, and Rough Trade is every bit as important now as it was then. I mean, much of what has happened in the past has fallen away, but then the culture has completely changed, as we know. We have digital culture now.
Yeah.
We don't know analog culture,
Yeah.
Well, we do, but
Well, vinyl's made something of a comeback, but I get it.
Oh, yeah,
but people don't, I mean, people don't buy albums. Let me rephrase that. The majority of people just go for the streaming, and that's how you can get a Sheeran or a Taylor Swift, and they've got which would never happen. Did they never get a phone call from, I don't know, MCA or saying we want to amalgamate you because, hey, we hear what you kids are doing and we'd really like to add you as our sort of subservient vassal state, as it were?
Well, I think there are two things there. The answer is yes. I think Jeff Travis has been approached on many occasions to align his talents with, the clout of a major record label. In fact, during the 1980s, he was part responsible for setting up Blanco Negro, which had bands like Everything But the Girl, the Jesus and Mary chain. And this was a label that was intended to be a halfway house between Rough Trade and, say, Warner Brothers. But inevitably, I think they don't work. I think, you can only be your own man, and Jeff Travis definitely is that. And I don't see any reason why he would need to make that alignment. He's definitely not in it for the money.
Sure.
If he was in it for the money, he'd have, cashed in a long time ago.
So when you sort of approach people to talk about this, presumably that they are quite willing to, because of a lot the bands like the Smiths, bands like Scritti Politti, which is, people might think that's surprising for Rough Trade, but because they might just think it's sort of, I don't know, Aretha Franklin and all that sort of stuff. But they started from the bottom and they weren't overproduced. They are a real band, real songwriters.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, Scritti Politti is still on the label. Green Gartside has been with Jeff Travis since 1978, and he's still there. And that was interesting in itself, the whole Scritti experiment, because initially the first record, so much was put into that record to try and make it a success. And then the label moved to the band moved to a major label and produced all these glossy sounding records. But I think when you go back and listen to them, they are a logical progression. That second Scritti album is fantastic,
So how long did it take you to get all this sort of together? I mean, this is obviously a very much because people are all over the place. I know we can do it all with sort of Zoom talks and whatever. But
we couldn't when I started. Yeah, when I started, still sort of doing it on recorders. Holding a recorder up to the phone.
Yeah. So I mean, because
you've got it static.
Yeah.
It took a couple of years, I think, to do the basic research, and then off you went. And of course, it is a people's history. It is the history of the people that were there, and people differ. There's a mosaic of views.
Yeah.
One person's view, Jeff's view, isn't always shared by somebody else's view, or their view isn't shared by Jeff. So, but I wanted to put all the warts and all views in.
And you've also got, sort of copies or pictures of the contracts, which that must have been interesting, because obviously today's contracts are legal and the whole thing. Were they a bit more sort of rough and ready, sort of back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, the contract, which I think is in the revised version of the book, it was literally a 50-50 contract, handwritten in biro. I think it's only 2 paragraphs long. That contract stayed in place more or less, right up to probably the collapse of the company initially in 1991. I mean, they've always wanted to do things, without taking advantage, overly commodifying the artist. And that's what that contract represented. A straight 50-50 split.
So what are you hoping that people will take? I mean, it is a label that's still influential. People are still popping into the shop in Portobello Road. I've got a listener just said I was just in there yesterday. Sent me a picture of the vinyl wall, etc. So, what are you hoping that people? Is it for people who want to find out more about the history of where, if you like, the movement came from, and also the fact that you can do business and
I think it was in. Sorry, Giles.
Right.
I think it was important to, put down on paper some sort of record of what is, after all, a British institution. Much the same with John Peel was a national treasure. I think Rough Trade is something of a national treasure. And because the shops exist, the mega store in Brick Lane and the various other shops, as you say, off Portobello Road, and I'm hoping that it will lead them to those shops to discover new vinyl or CDs, whatever.
Or even let's bring back C60 cassettes. In my case, I mean, whatever you want to do,
C60. Bow wow wow!
Wow! Exactly. Now we are really dating ourselves, Neil. We are really dating ourselves. The book is called "Document and Eyewitness: An Intimate History of Rough Trade." It is by, of course, Neil Taylor, who we're speaking to today. Neil, if people want to find you online, listeners, you can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Click on the front cover; it'll be winging its way to you. If people want to find you online, do you have a social media presence? Can people say nice things to you online?
I don't have a social media presence.
Congratulations.
I'm seeing how much it rots the brains of people, so I've got other ways of rotting my brain.
Indeed. So what's next in the pipeline, Neil? What are you going to do after this, apart from have a large drink and a lie down?
Yeah, well, I've just finished a book on it's a history of rock as told through readers' letters to the music press. And it's everything from 1959 up to virtually the death of the music press it goes up to about 2020. There are letters in there from 16-year-old David Bowie, Brian Jones writing into the enemy, correcting them, saying, look, you listed these 10 records as R&B records. There's only 9 of them. Actually, 9 of them aren't R&B records. I mean, it's incredible. David Bowie writing in, how can I become successful? It's impossible, so on and so forth. So there's a sort of collection, and it sort of puts together a history of something through the voices of the people.
When people actually had to go and write a letter and then go and mail it, get a stamp and mail it, rather than just angrily going, I think the new Smiths record is whatever, and then pressing send. It was much more of a commitment, Neil.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and buying a stamp. You had to buy a stamp.
Buying a stamp, exactly. First class as well out of my as a 14-year-old. But this book is called Document and Eyewitness: An Intimate History of Rough Trade. It's by Neil Taylor. Neil, we will get you back on to talk about. That sounds fascinating. At this point, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles. Cheers. Have a good day.